Hello and welcome to The Diverse Bookshelf with me, Samia Aziz. On this show, I interview incredible authors doing a deep dive into important themes and issues while talking all things books. This week's episode is a special end-of-year wrap-up show where I'm going to move into the seat of being interviewed rather than interviewing somebody. I've asked my husband, Malik Wasim, to come on the show and interview me all about this very podcast. I put a post out on Instagram so people have got in touch with their burning questions all about running your own podcast, about this specific show, and about books. So I'm going to hand it over to Wasim, who's now going to take the host seat and interview me for today's episode.
Thank you, Samia. First of all, let me ask you, how are you feeling about this whole experience being on the other side?
I'm feeling really nervous, and now I'm thinking about what my guests must be feeling when I interview them. It feels certainly more intimidating than being the interviewer for sure.
Yeah, I can imagine that. And especially, I know that when this idea came not long ago, probably a couple of days ago, and then you decided, yes, this is something you should be doing. And I really think like that was a great idea. And actually, I'm excited looking at the list of questions I have in front of me. I'm sure I'm going to go and ask, and people will listen. But before that, it would be great to hear from you. Especially, I think I have been looking at you, working on this project a while now. What do you feel like? What is your major highlight or takeaway? Let me put it this way. What are your key three takeaways being a minority group in this country and then leading on something like this, being a woman?
That's a really good question and a really big question. So the podcast itself is aimed at promoting and supporting people from minority communities. And I think it goes one step further because of, as you said, like I myself, a person of minority community, like a minority community within another minority community, and maybe even another in almost again. I think it can be really daunting when you see how many successful podcasts there are, and out of those, how many of those tend to be by people who are from like the majority, especially in the West. But I'm really proud of the space that I am creating and we are creating as a community with this show. I'm really pleased that I'm able to learn and grow so much from this. And I think my voice really matters. I think that's the biggest thing that I've learned, is that this space really matters and my voice really matters. And I think it's such a privilege and an honor for me to be in the position that I am.
Great. I think it's great to hear like you feel like your voice matters. This made me think to ask you this question, like what was your motivation? Like what was that moment when you decided, okay, this is something you're going to do?
So as you know, that I am an avid reader. Like our house, there are books in every corner.
Oh yeah, I can tell that.
And I have always loved reading from just a few years old. I started to read very young, and I've always had a book in my hand, a book in my bag. And I think increasingly I have felt like the publishing industry more generally tends to promote certain authors, certain already very privileged, already very sort of with exposure and with platforms. Authors are getting the space to talk about their work. But there are so many incredible books and so many incredible authors that just don't get the same space. And I have felt like these are really like hidden gems and really sort of treasures that are getting missed out on, but that these people have really important things to say. And I felt like, I really wanted to help create that space. But also, I think as a reader, you can read a book, depending on how quick your reading speed is, within a few hours or a few days or a few weeks. But often authors are spending years and years working on this piece of work, and I think we're missing out by not hearing from them. And so I really wanted to sort of bridge that gap between the reading community and the authors.
That's very interesting to hear. Like as a reader, that benefits you to read and then share with others, but also then providing that space to those authors who are not getting that kind of limelight or even some sort of a recognition to be asked like what was their experience like being an author. So it's great. I'm not a good reader, but I feel like if you are a reader, don't you think that the natural step would be becoming an author? Why a podcaster?
I mean, becoming an author is not everybody's life trajectory. It's not necessarily what everybody wants to do. Also, as you know, I do write, and maybe one day that is something that I will do more of. I would love to become a published author one day, but right now, I think the thing that I want to do is I want to create conversation and I want to build community. And right now, this is what I want to focus on, and this is what I think is really important.
Sure. Thank you very much. Well, so I think we should head towards the questions, which I can say broadly are in three categories. So we can start with the first one, and then I think we will continue with our discussions as well. So the first question I have, the set of questions is basically on the podcast reflections. The second one is more kind of technicalities around the podcast and equipment and stuff like that. And the last one is more about the books. So, starting with the first one, the first question I have is, what is your vision for the diverse bookshelf?
I mean, we've spoken a little bit about this already so far, but really the vision for the show is to have a place, a community where having conversations about some of life's huge questions and themes and issues and speaking to authors that are writing about these, but the authors are from minority backgrounds. So it's about giving a voice to some people that are not necessarily promoted, authors that are not promoted as much as they should be, in order to encourage people to read more widely and to also encourage people to think about some really big themes and issues. So on the show, we talk a lot about identity and belonging, about migrant and refugee experiences. We talk about current affairs and politics, about faith, and about community more generally.
Okay. So, do you think, like, when you started your podcast, at that point, whatever you were thinking as a vision for this postcard kept on evolving as well? Like, or is it like something you kept in your mind from the beginning and that's what you're heading towards? Or is it something like the more you interview people and author, the more you come to know about the challenges and opportunities, and it is like something keeps on evolving?
That's a really interesting question because I think generally my vision for the podcast has always been the same. I think what's happening with time is I feel that the need for this space and the need for us to sort of, or like for me to claim or reclaim my own identity and to promote our stories and share our voices, I feel the need for that is growing. And maybe because it feels more important, it might be, I don't know, like fueling it almost in some ways. But I think largely it's always been there.
Okay, cool. I think this nicely leads us to the next question, which is what have been some of the highlights of the show?
I mean, the show is all about interviewing authors, which as an avid reader feels like my dream. It's really incredible, some of the conversations that have happened on the show. In fact, I'd say all of them have been absolutely amazing. I got to interview Huda Fahmy, who is an illustrator and a writer. And Huda is somebody that I have been following and I have enjoyed her cartoons and her work for absolute years. And I mean, as even like as a teenager and when I was growing up, I found a lot of comfort in her cartoons, which explore Muslim identity in the West. And I think that was one of the most special interviews because of how long I have admired her. And also because it was just so funny. Like at the end of the show, like my jaw was aching because of how much we had been laughing. And so I think that's definitely a highlight. I think as well when I hear from authors during the recording and afterwards in reflections, just about how much they appreciate the space and how comfortable they feel in speaking to me. I think it makes me feel so empowered, but also just so grateful to be able to do this.
That's interesting. Would it be a difficult question if I asked, like, who was the best author you have interviewed, or rather, you would go and give me a diplomatic answer? Honestly, feel free to just pass on.
Yeah, I can't answer that question. That feels a very impossible question. It's like asking a parent who their favorite child is. Like, I can't. I will say with full certainty that like every episode, because every episode is so different as well. Every episode has been an absolute pleasure to record so far. It's been really fun, but such an education for me as well. I don't think I have a favorite.
Okay, that's absolutely fine. Well, as we know, like whatever we do, there are ups and downs, whether it's like related to your family or profession, and especially something completely new when you don't have huge experience of doing something which you are trying to start or do first time. That can even become more challenging and bring a lot of uncertainties. So my next question is around it is not my question. Yeah, I'm just reading that question. What are some of the things that have not gone so well?
Yeah, I mean, whenever you start something, there are lessons that you learn, there are things that don't go so well. I mean, thankfully, I haven't had any huge disasters with the show. I think you would know if I did, but I haven't had any huge issues. I think it takes a while when you're doing something like starting a podcast to get into the flow of understanding what it is that you need, what it is that you need from your guests, how clear you have to be in communication sometimes. There's been a couple of things that have not gone so well and have kind of continued to haunt me. I had one guest whose name I will not mention that came on the show, and I had been speaking to this person's publicist and agent for months, literally for like 6 months. I think I was trying to get this person on the show because I really wanted to interview them. I loved their work. And the guest turned up and logged into the show, and they were at the gym. And it was the most uncomfortable situation because I didn't know how to handle it. And I was trying to tell them that maybe we should reschedule, but they seemed adamant that they wanted to go on. But obviously, like, I couldn't record with them being in the gym. Like, the sound was awful. It was just terrible.
Mm.
We ended up continuing with the recording, but this person then went to their car, which helped from like a sound perspective.
Sure.
But it left such a bitter taste in my mouth. And I think, like, as a reader, has impacted my relationship with this author.
Is this the same? Like, honestly, I'm thinking like I remember you mentioning once, or maybe more than once, like there was somebody who didn't turn up, and then when you reminded, they were like, "Oh, completely forgot." Is this the same one, or was it a different?
No, this is a different one. This
Okay,
is,
so there are
yeah.
quite a few challenges when it comes to getting hold of people as well.
Yeah, I think sometimes, I mean, there have been a couple of instances where, as you said, where people haven't turned up because they've forgotten or they've gotten confused, or they've not found the link in time. And I think that can happen with remote recording because it seems sometimes that it can get more messy if somebody knows that they're going to meet you in person in a studio in London, for example. I think it's a little bit more maybe straightforward, or a little bit more clear on arrangements. But online, I think sometimes it can get a little bit lost. It's happened a couple of times. There was one author that just didn't turn up, and it has now been like 6 months later and I still haven't heard from them. It doesn't happen that often, I'm very pleased to say, but it did happen once. And I don't know what happened. I contacted the publisher, who said that they also haven't heard from that author. I think the thing to do in that case is to be able to pick yourself up and not take it personally. I think sometimes life just gets too busy and people do forget. I don't think there is anything different I could have done. I did really worry with the author that turned up from the gym. I really worried if it was because they weren't taking me seriously enough. And it really, as you know, like, I was actually really upset about it because I felt like they just think this is a joke. Like, they think I'm a joke. Because, yeah, at the time as well, it was really early on in the show. So there had only been a few episodes, and, I didn't really have much to show for the show at that point. And I felt like they just think that I'm nobody and that this is a joke.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really difficult to sort of step out of that and just let it go and not take it personally and just think that, no, actually this person messed up.
Okay, cool. I mean, I have two follow-up questions before we move on to the next one. how demotivating it could be, like if you had a commitment with an author and the author didn't turn, like I'm just thinking from a new, like somebody new who is aiming to or thinking to start a podcast, what advice you will give? I know you said you would not take it personally, but how demotivating it could be, and what is the best way to get out of that?
I think, especially if it's somebody that you've A, been really looking forward to interviewing, and B, if it's an interview that you've really, really spent a lot of time preparing for, it can really offset you if that doesn't happen, if they don't turn up, because to you this is a form of work, regardless of whether or not there's any money involved. This is a project you're working on, and so to have somebody not turn up can be really difficult to deal with. I think one of the easy ways, I think, is to try and speak to them and find out what happened. In my experience, a lot of the time it's a very innocent mistake, and usually the author will be very apologetic and they will reschedule very quickly and they will show that they're really interested in speaking to you still. So then you very quickly let it go because it was a mistake. If, as I have been in that situation where you just don't hear back from the author, that can be really difficult, like very, very confusing. But also, if that does happen, I guess that is an indication as to maybe the priorities that author is having, or maybe what they're dealing with in their personal life, because it's important to remember that this is also a person at the other end of the line. But, and sometimes, doing a podcast interview is not that important. It's not the thing that they're focusing on or that they want to give a lot of their attention to, and we have to accept that as well.
Sure, makes sense. And the second follow on question on that one, was there a time, like, for example, if you were interviewing somebody and during the interview you felt like it's not going as you thought, or it, like, if you got a reflection from the author like they might not be enjoying the interview, how difficult that situation could be if you have ever experienced?
That's a really tough position to be in. I haven't had an author tell me that they are uncomfortable with me or that they're not happy with the way that the interview is going from my perspective. I've had two occasions. I've had one occasion where the author themselves felt like they were not performing very well. I thought that actually they were doing great, but they thought that they were just not happy with the way that they were answering questions, etc. So I worked with them to we did attempt a second, like a re-record, but also I worked with them in terms of the edit, and I think we recorded an extra question or two, and that was completely fine. And I think that that's okay if the author is not comfortable, if they didn't think that they were doing very well, that's fine. And then I've had one interview that I recorded that just didn't go very well. I felt like I just wasn't getting much from the person I was interviewing, and that was it was really sad, really, to be in that position, because unfortunately I haven't released that episode, because when I think about my listeners, I think they won't enjoy it, and I've had to have a difficult conversation in telling the publicist that I don't feel comfortable with putting the show out. But I think it's important. I think it's important to remember that this is also something that people will be listening to, and that I hope that they will take something away from. And fundamentally, it's my show, and I'm able to make that decision and to stand firm in that as well.
Sure, makes sense. So the next question, and honestly, some of the part of this question we have already covered, but feel free to bring in any other highlights. So the question is, tell me about some of the lessons you have learned.
Oh, I do like this question. I think I've learned some really big things. I've learned a lot. I mean, I've learned a lot from every episode in terms of sort of knowledge and information, for sure. But the podcast has also taught me about bravery. It's taught me about the need to really go for something and really just shoot your shot. And it has taught me that there are circumstances where the worst thing that can happen is somebody will say no. I have really wanted desperately to interview authors, and I've thought, like, oh, there's no way this person is going to want to come on my show. Like, I'm just, the podcast is really small. And then I've sent the email and they've turned around and they've said within 24 hours, they've said, absolutely yes. And I've just been blown away by how receptive some people are. And so I really learned that you literally have nothing to lose, but you have so much to gain from just trying.
So sometimes it's important to try. Even it could be just a mental barrier. You might be thinking, no, there's no way that this author is going to even look at your email. So I think that's a very important one, especially for the new people, like people who might be considering this side of things, that things might look difficult or even sometimes impossible until unless you give it a chance. So I completely agree, and from my own experiences from different matters of my life, I can relate with it. Well, okay, what else?
I think the other thing I've learned is that you really don't know how much people will take away from something. And what I mean is that I have received some really, really heartfelt messages from people who've been listening to the show. And I've just been blown away by how much of an impact you can have on somebody. And I think it's really important to remember that more broadly,
Sorry, is it the people who you are interviewing or the listeners?
the listeners,
Okay,
that yeah, like I think it's really important to remember that what may seem like something fairly small to you, or small in terms of like how much of an impact you think it may have, actually can be so big. Like I've had people that have said, I've changed my mind about an issue, I've changed my mind about a book, I've changed my mind about an author. This episode has really helped me. I found it really healing. Like these are really big things. And I think it's important to remember that we can all have such a big impact on other people.
okay. So just one, while you were saying this, and I was thinking, like, from my own experience, I know sometimes people who write books on various topics, but then at the same time, you see them not taking a position on a matter which they might have, spoke about or wrote about in their book. It could be anything related to, inclusion, or it could be related to any political, situation in a country. They don't take that kind of a very clear stance. Do you think, have you experienced that, and how difficult it is to comprehend?
Yeah, I mean, this is actually an issue that has been plaguing me over the last few months. Obviously, at the time that we're recording this episode, Israel has been attacking Gaza for almost 3 months, 2.5 months, I think now, almost 80 days. And it is clearly a genocide. There have been words to describe it, like, an onslaught, an attack, a war. But I think the thing that is most fitting is genocide. And we are seeing the impact of a colonial project on a state that is nothing other than genocide. And unfortunately, I think one of the most difficult thing has been seeing authors that have written their books about the British Empire and written books about decolonization and refugees and wars in other countries that have not spoken out about what's going on in Palestine. I have seen it many times at the moment. And I think generally there has been a lot of silence from the publishing industry, a lot of silence from authors that, for whatever reason, are taking either a very neutral stance or a very harmful stance, or are just silent. And we know that in crisis and in genocide and conflict and war, if you are silent, you are enabling the oppressor. And unfortunately, that has played out a lot in recent months. So, yeah, I've seen it, and it's made me think very deeply about which authors I want to be supporting and I want to be reading going forwards.
Okay, makes sense. Thanks for sharing that experience. I'm conscious about the time as well, because I can see some of the very kind of good questions which might be very helpful for the listeners. But before moving to the second category of the questions, my last question, not again, sorry, not my question. That's like one of the questions we have received. Is there anything, or maybe more than a thing, you wish you knew before you started your own podcast? Very common question, I think.
Yeah, that. I mean, that is quite a generic question. I would actually say not really. I think I did a fair amount of research before starting the show. I have enjoyed learning the things that I didn't know. And I think that the podcast space is continually evolving. Yeah, I'd say that's pretty much it. I don't think that I've learned anything that I really wish that, oh, I really wish I knew this before. Because I think the other thing to remember is that, like live spaces like podcasts, it's very easy to fix any mistakes, in the sense that if you don't know something for your first episode, if you know it going forwards, it's very easy to implement things into change. So yeah, that's what I'd say on that question.
Okay, thank you very much. So, moving towards the next category, which is more around the technicalities of the podcast. The first very specific question: how do you approach authors? I feel like it's the most difficult thing when you think about starting a podcast. Like, how are you gonna, bring those authors on board?
Yeah, I mean, I actually have guests on the show in a variety of ways. The easiest way to approach an author is to approach the publisher. So if you know that this book published by the author is published by, say, HarperCollins or Penguin, let's use Penguin as an example, you need to find a contact at Penguin. Usually on their website, they will have like a press and media or marketing contact email address, even if it's a generic one. The first point of call is to contact that email address and express your interest and explain what's going on. They will usually put you in contact with the author's publicist or agent and then take it from there. I have a lot of contacts in publishing already from before the show because I have my Bookstagram account, Read with Samia. So I have a lot of contacts. So I found it quite easy to find the right contact publishers. The other way to do it is to contact an author directly from using social media. Sometimes they will then tell you to email them or to email their publicist. So that also works. One of the things that's happening with me, which I'm really grateful for, is that authors and publishers are now approaching me directly, and there have been for quite a few months now, where they will say, we're working on this book. Would you consider interviewing the author on your show? And I will usually say that I'm interested, but I'm not going to commit until I've read the book. So either they'll send me the book or, we'll have a conversation. So that's usually how it works at the moment.
Okay, so just a follow-on question on that one. To put this into a perspective, like if you are approaching, say, 10 publishers, what's the likelihoodness? How many of them would respond? And out of those 10, whichever number is responding, how many you will end up interviewing?
Oh, that's a very good question.
I'm just trying to look at the success rate.
Yeah, I'd say like generally, I haven't had a huge number of authors that have said no. There have been a few. There have been a few that have sort of said that they're not interested or that they're not doing podcast interviews at the moment, especially some of the bigger ones. Like the more successful authors. For example, I really wanted to interview Rebecca Kwong, who wrote Babel and Yellowface, but her publicist has told me several times now that she's not taking on podcast interviews, which is fine. Usually contact hearing back from publishers is like, usually the communication is quite good in that they do get back to me. I have found that I'm often chasing, though. I'm having to follow up. And that's because, people are usually very busy. And I think that's quite a normal thing
that makes sense.
That happens, especially when authors are traveling or authors are not based in the UK. It's not their fault. Sometimes they'll say like, oh, we just haven't heard back. So I've had, like, I'd say fairly few instances where people have not been interested, which is really good because it can feel quite demotivating, and that sometimes it's not possible. Sometimes I'm just not hearing back, and I will then need to change tactics, and I'll either need to like send a message to their Instagram page, and I'll ask for another contact, or I'll contact one of my Bookstagram friends and I'll ask them if they have another contact at the same publisher, and I'll try and find another way to get through to them. But yeah, that's what I'd say.
Thank you. That's helpful. Okay, so the next question is a bit long. I think the way we should do it, probably, I'm going to read the whole question first, and then I'm happy to go and read the bits of it, and you can respond that way. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Cool. So has starting the podcast had an impact on your reading life? And that's the first part of the question. And it goes, do you read more critically, or do you still get caught up in the story, knowing you will get to ask the author questions about how they came to this piece of work?
I really like this question. This is a really good question. My reading has been impacted by the podcast. I will not lie. Like, I wish I could just say like, no, it hasn't, but it has. And not so much in terms of how I consume books, but I think a lot before even picking up a book about whether or not this could be a potential for the show, I am more inclined to read books based on the fact that I want to interview the author or that I want to consider to interview the author. I'm going to read a book if a publisher has contacted me and asked me if I will consider interviewing the author for sure. So there is that as well. In terms of whether or not I read more critically, I don't think the actual reading experience has changed for me personally, and that's because I think I am always a critical reader. I think I've always been the type to come up, like I've always had questions when I'm reading. I always tend to remember the book for quite a while afterwards as well, and remember details as well. I think what has changed though is that I have a deadline often if I need to read a book by a certain time, which can change my relationship with the book. It can feel a little bit more pressured, which is not what I want, but it does happen sometimes. But I'm in a really fortunate position in that I am really interested in making sure that I'm not just interviewing authors with new releases. I'm really interested in interviewing authors more generally. So sometimes I'm interviewing an author whose books I read years ago or months ago, in which case my preparation is quite different. And so in that case, sometimes I'm not rereading the book again at all, but I'm thinking about it, I'm remembering it, I'm rereading certain parts of it. And that I find really enjoyable in being able to interview somebody whose work I read years ago.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And while you were answering, and I was just thinking, like, would this position change if you happen to, publish a book yourself and then being in this position? But that's fine. You don't need to answer that. Moving on to the next question. Interesting question. What equipment has made the biggest difference? Does the size of the microphone matters?
Okay, so I'm going to be very honest in that I don't know too much about technical things and equipment like microphones, but I have learned that I don't think it's the size of the microphone per se. Like, I don't think it matters hugely if it's a big one or a large one, but it is important to have a look at how good a microphone is in terms of its the way that it gets rid of background noise and echo, how good it is in terms of how far out it picks up noise, whether you record from the side or from the top. Like, I think these things matter most. I think having a good microphone, like, it's definitely improved the quality of sound on my end. The problem I have is that I record the podcast remotely, and most of my guests are not even in the same country as me, let alone the same city as me. And so I have very limited control over the quality of sound on their side. At the moment, unfortunately, I can't do anything about it. I mean, I was speaking to one of my friends who has a podcast, and she says that the requirement of a guest coming on her show is that they have their own microphone. Now, I personally don't feel like that I want to introduce that limitation, because I know not everybody will be in a position to buy their own microphone. I also don't want to be sending people or giving people microphones in order to interview them. So at the moment, I can't do much about it. I don't know if that would change if I change to an in-person setup in the studio at some point later, but at the moment, that's sort of where I am with that.
So on the last bit of your response, so if author don't have like a good quality mic, you would still interview them rather than making them probably, I think I can say that, digitally excluded from that part.
For sure. I think even laptops have fairly okay like speakers and microphones at the moment. I think that they pick up sound depending on your recording facility. That is okay. It may not be professional, but I think for me, what is the most important thing is the content of the conversation. And I think my listeners generally understand that too.
Sure. And a follow-up question from my own side, actually. And I think I know the answer, but I think it will be good for the listeners. Where did you buy this mic?
This one, oh my gosh, well, you do know because you bought this mic for me. This mic we actually got from Cash Converters.
Yeah.
So, we are real avid secondhand shoppers. We we really care about sustainability and the environment. And so, yeah, this microphone, I'm using a Blue Yeti. We got it from Cash Converters for I think like 50 or 60 pounds. A new one is sort of in the hundreds. So I think we got an absolute bargain. And I would actually suggest people to look for secondhand microphones because usually they're in pretty good condition. But there's also shops and businesses, I don't know any names off the top of my head, but they sell secondhand goods and equipment, but they also sell what is like, when you go to a shop and there's model stock out, then they will sell that at a reduced price. I think that those are really good ways of getting good quality products, but at a reduced cost.
Sure. And I think I would like to link this response to your previous question's response, that I think there shouldn't be any excuse. Like if your content is strong and good, then equipment probably can be, there could be still kind of a chance that you can get along. I know, I completely agree, like equipment does matter. It has a big role. Imagine like if you have very fancy, expensive equipment, but your content is not great. I don't think so that thing gonna work as compared to vice versa. So I think sometimes, for example, I do caught up with like these things. Like if I don't have like everything in order, like all the things in order, I might not initiate on whatever I'm thinking about. But I'm glad to hear like what you said. Like it's more about content, and then probably to look at focus, have your focus on the equipment.
Yeah, I'd really say, like, if you are somebody that is thinking about starting your own podcast, please don't let a lack of equipment or money in that regard hold you back. I think, as your show grows and as you evolve as a podcast host or whatever it may be, your circumstances around your equipment will change for sure, but don't let it hold you back because you will just get stuck.
Makes sense. Okay, cool. So the last question from this category: how much time do you spend on the show?
Oh my gosh. That's a very big question because I spend a lot of time working on the show.
Because it's not just that bit when you are interviewing the author. So maybe think about how much time you spend in preparation, like pre interview and then post interview.
Yeah, so it it varies definitely. Like it definitely varies, but sometimes it can I can be emailing with an agent back and forth for months, which is not just the time but the frustration and the energy that goes into that. So that is definitely a thing. Sometimes it can take a lot of time to set up an interview, and then the preparation takes time. So if I factor in the time it takes me to read a book, it takes me probably, I'd say, maybe altogether, maybe like 12 hours or so to read a book. If I spread that over across a week, that's like 2 or 3 hours a day sometimes. And if I don't have that time, it can take me weeks. I don't want to like skim read or read very fast. So it does take me about 12 hours, I would say, on average, because obviously it depends on the length of the book. And then comes the preparation for the actual interview. I don't tend to make notes while I'm reading because I find it really distracting, and I find that I can get in my head and I can get distracted and just go off on a tangent. So I prefer to read in one go, and then I will do like a brain dump. I will write down things that I'm thinking, things that I'm feeling, and it will help me write questions. But I will also read. I will also read articles that the author has written. I may listen to other podcast interviews. I may read other interviews that they've done, because sometimes it's important to understand the style of an author before you think about what you're going to ask them and how. So it can take me, I don't want to really give it like a monetary thing, but it can probably take me altogether, I'd say maybe like 2 full days of work, or like 2 full days or 3 full days to prepare for one episode.
That's including the reading.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
So if I have to ask, let's take out the reading, because different people can have different speed when it comes to reading. Then what one show would mean in terms of the time commitment if you take out the reading bit?
So I'd say a full day of preparation. So if we talk like a 24-hour window, I'd say a full day of preparation. If you gave me 2 full days of preparation, I would love that. I would love to be able to do that. The more time I have to prepare, would be better. But obviously, I have work commitments and life commitments, so I can't do everything. So I'd say a full day of commitment. Then there's an editing process, and that also I'd say is probably another full day. So we're looking at about 2 full days. That's probably spread out across a week. So yeah, I'd say that's probably roughly how much an episode each is taking me at the moment. Sometimes they take less, depending on how familiar I am with the author. But yeah, it's about 2 days, I'd say.
Great, thank you. Hope it would be helpful for the listeners as well. And with that, moving towards the last bit of the interview, which is around books. And as we know, like we are approaching the end of this year, which is full of experiences for every person. There could be different experiences when it comes to the year end. They might have had very good number of like good times, and then some downtimes, and maybe different in other cases. So as we are discussing the book section here now, in the last category, not the section, first question is about what is your book of the year 2023?
Oh no, I almost, when this question came in,
is it as difficult as answering? Yeah, obviously you would be answering then best author in this case.
Yeah, I almost told this person that sent in the question that I wasn't going to answer the question because I don't like this question. I don't have a book of 2023, unfortunately, because I just can't. I feel like it's sometimes really difficult to compare books as well. But I will take this time actually to talk about some of the things that I have loved reading this year. 2023, I read some authors for the first time that I hadn't read. I read R.F. Kuang, I read Babel and Yellowface for the first time, which I loved both of them. Very different from one another, but amazing books, both of them. I also actually read Isabella Hamad for the first time this year. I read both The Parisian and Enter Ghost, which I also really enjoyed. I think she is an insanely talented writer. She's British Palestinian, and the stories that she is telling are so important, especially now with everything going on in the region. I think that my reading has been overshadowed a lot since October because of everything happening in Palestine, but I have enjoyed being able to educate and inform myself even further, in the sense that I kind of felt like it was more important for me to make sure that I was reading Palestinian voices at the moment. So I have been reading a lot more around Palestine. I read Rashid Khalidi's The 100 Year on Palestine fairly recently, which I found such an education and so informative. I also read Minor Detail. And as I said, I've been reading Isabella Hamad. I've been reading a lot of Ilan Pape as well. So yeah, that's probably what I would say in response to that question. I know it's not an answer of the question, although actually I will talk about one highlight, is that I had an early copy of Sarah Hussein's Hidden Fires, which is coming out in February of 2024. And I think we are so lucky to have a second book by her because she is absolutely incredible. I loved that book and I cannot wait for it to come out next year.
Okay, cool. Makes sense. Okay, moving to the next question. Is there a character in one of the books you have read that you would like to meet?
Yes. Oh, I really love this question. And yeah, I mean, whenever I read a book, like a fiction story, the characters always feel so real. So I often leave a book feeling as though I really wish I could meet these people. So Sarah Hussein, again, actually, her debut novel is called The Family Tree, and those characters.
Is it a fiction?
It's a fiction, yeah. It's an intergenerational sort of family saga, and those characters, Sahil and Essen and Zara, like they are so wonderful. And Amjad, I would really love to meet them just as people. Like I think it would be so great if we could have them round for tea one day. Like I just think they're so wonderful. Also, I recently read Enter Ghost by Isabella Hamad, and that the protagonist Sonia is so interesting. I would also really like to meet her. And there's another character in that book called Mariam, who is like sort of very creative, really activisty, really strong, independent woman. I'd also really like to meet her. But if I think outside of what I've read recently, I think I'd love to meet any of the characters and anything that Toni Morrison has written, because all of Toni Morrison's characters are so raw and powerful and imperfect. I would love to meet them. And I would also, I think, love to meet Hafsa Zayan has written a book called We Are All Birds of Uganda. And Hassan, the grandfather, I think I would also like to meet him.
Okay, great. So before I ask the last question, are you feeling nervous now? I know you were feeling a little bit nervous at the beginning.
No, I'm not feeling nervous now.
Okay,
I'm feeling quite relaxed
and
now.
I hope I did the justice so far. I don't know, like obviously this is not my thing, but maybe listeners can give you feedback. How did I interview you? Guys, I didn't had any chance to prepare. I do have a list of questions in front of me, but whatever follow-up questions I've been asking, that's just like what I could think about. So the last question is, what are some of the books you are looking forward to in 2024, which is literally a few days from now?
That I mean, I think I already spoke about Sarah Hussain's newest book, Hidden Fires, which is coming out I think in January. Now, normally at this point, I'm really good with knowing exactly what's coming out next year, and I've had a bunch of proofs come through the door, and I know what I'm going to be reading and what's coming out. Unfortunately, I have had some books arrive for next year, but I have not been in the headspace to really think about it in terms of what books are coming out next year. However, I will say that I do know that some of our favorite authors are coming back with more books next year. But I will talk about the hopes I have for publishing. And I hope that publishing is just more open next year. I hope that we see some real thought about some of the books that are coming out. I hope that more authors from minority and underrepresented communities get their voices out and get their stories told. I really hope that we do justice to the stories that are being told, and that there is a greater emphasis on sort of sensitivity reading and thinking really deeply about representation. I hope as a Muslim woman that I start to see more Muslim women that defy the tropes and stereotypes that we seem to be saturated with. So that's really my hopes for 2024. I will on Instagram. I will start shortly paying more attention to books for 2024. So if you are interested, then please keep an eye out.
Great. So this is the end of the questions, but I think I just want to. I'm wondering, like, if you have any sort of a message for your listeners or the people who you have as part of your family on Instagram.
I mean, my huge message to anyone that's been listening to the show is thank you for listening. Thank you for the feedback. And I really hope that you stick around. I really hope that the show is helping in some way. I hope that it is inspiring and interesting. I hope that you find some kind of like healing and support and empowerment in it, because I think the best podcasts I listen to, I feel like I'm sat in a room with friends. So I hope that you too feel like you're sat in a room with your friends.
Okay, cool. Apologies that I said like that's the end of the questions, and thanks to you, Samia, that pointing on that screen with the last question. So I have a few more questions before we end the show, which we are about to now. The last question I have is from someone is, what can we expect from the show in 2024?
Largely, you can expect more of the same, I hope. Interesting conversations, diverse authors. But I am hoping in 2024 that we open up a little bit. So I'm hoping to invite on book lovers more generally. So I'm hoping that we interview public speakers and activists, creatives, people working in publishing, book bloggers, whole other sort of realm of people, because I think authors are amazing and I will continue to interview authors, but the conversations are around books. So I hope that we have more interesting and inspiring conversations.
That sounds exciting. And by the way, congratulations for hitting the 50K downloads on podcast. Like, I'm proud of you.
Thank you. Thank you. That was a real achievement. So the Diverse Bookshelf podcast last week hit 50,000 downloads, which feels really huge because I think relatively the show is still new, it's still quite small. As you know, it's like a one-woman show. And so it really it feels amazing that so many people have been listening to so many episodes
That's
of the
great.
show.
That's great. And by the way, guys, this is totally off script. This is not written, and she didn't ask me to mention this. I'm genuinely glad that obviously I do look at Samia, like making effort, reading books, even sometimes in the bad when it's time to turn off the light. But I can see that. One last question. I know you have a very nice bookshelf, and I'm sure you must have posted a lot of pictures of that. There are books in the kitchen, there are books upstairs in the bedroom. Do you have any kind of idea how you're gonna organize them in 2024?
Oh my gosh. I'm
This
being
is
called
again off the
out.
script. I was not meant to ask, but I thought it's a good opportunity for ask and make her to make a commitment that there'll be a better way to manage the books.
I mean, there is one way that we could do it is if you buy me another bookshelf. If you
But do we have space to
if
book
you
the bookshelf?
allocate me another space in the house for my books, that would
Mm.
solve the problem. No, but seriously, this is a genuine problem in that my book collection is growing at a faster speed than I'm reading, and I'm very pleased to say that I'm not spending very much money on books. If I buy, I tend to buy secondhand, but because of the podcast and other things, a lot of books are still finding their way to me, and also because everybody in my life knows that I'm a reader, so I get gifted a lot of books as well from people that like me. But it is a problem. I'm hoping that I have another clear out at some point soon and just sort of reduce the collection overall so that it doesn't overflow the bookshelf. But I can't make any commitments, I'm afraid.
That's fine. I think as long as the circle keeps on going. So as you said, like you do give away. I think that's good. That's the end of questions, really, from my side. I don't know if there is anything else you want to, say at the end.
No, well, thank you to you, Vaseem,
You're
for
welcome.
interviewing me today. But as always, guys, if you have enjoyed this episode, please follow and subscribe to the Diverse Bookshelf on your podcast platform of choice and connect with me on social media. Also, it would be really great if you could leave a review as it helps more people find the show.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone.
Bye!
Bye.